She stood in the half-dark, her body shaking not from the cold, but from the certainty of what was to come. The young German nurse, still in her torn field uniform, had been marched into the yard of a camp in Louisiana in the late summer of 1944. Her captors had given no explanation, no words of comfort, only orders barked in English she scarcely understood. To her, every step echoed like the tolling of a bell. She had tended the wounded of the Wehrmacht, had followed doctors across battlefields from North Africa to France, and now she was reduced to this, a prisoner stripped of her tools, her training, and her future. She closed her eyes, waiting for the crack of rifles, but instead of the final volley, she opened them to a different light. Blinding white bulbs swung above her, illuminating polished steel and rows of instruments she had once known intimately. It was not the courtyard of death she faced, but the operating theater of an American field hospital, where she expected the end. She found the beginning of something unthinkable. Gloved hands steadied her arms. A voice, calm and firm, gave an order she could not follow. Yet the intent was unmistakable: to heal, not to kill. This reversal was more than a twist of destiny. For someone indoctrinated since youth to believe that Americans were barbarians without mercy, the shock was unbearable. She remembered the propaganda films, the whispered warnings from German officers that if captured she would be left to rot or executed. Now, lying on a clean table beneath humming lights, she was confronted with a contradiction her mind could barely hold. It is here that the story truly begins, where war collides with compassion, and the roles of enemy and victim blur beyond recognition. She was not the first to face such a moment. Statistics from the U.S. Army Medical Department reveal that between 1943 and 1945, over 430,000 German prisoners of war were treated for illness and injury on American soil. Numbers that seem abstract became intensely real as the nurse felt the sting of antiseptic on her wounds. A colleague of hers, a captured medic named Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, would later write in a diary smuggled through the camp, "We were prepared for humiliation, for death. Instead, I saw doctors treat us as if we were their own. It was worse than defeat. It was disarming." Such testimony adds weight to the moment, showing how one nurse's shock mirrored that of thousands. The nurse lay in silence, her heart racing not from fear alone, but from confusion. In that confusion, a new possibility began to flicker: that war's boundaries might not be as absolute as she had believed. That survival could come, not from loyalty to a flag, but from the unexpected mercy of a stranger. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you hear these words? Night had fallen over the camp, a silence broken only by the muffled boots of guards and the creak of wooden watchtowers. Beyond the fences, the cicadas of the Louisiana fields sang endlessly, a strange soundtrack for men and women far from the ruins of Europe. Inside one of the barracks, the German nurse lay half awake on a cot, still wrapped in bandages from the operation that had saved her. The light from the infirmary had faded, but another light was about to emerge, not from bulbs, but from human hands. The civilian population near the camp had been told to keep their distance. These were, after all, the enemy soldiers and auxiliaries of a machine that had brought the world to fire. Yet in small southern towns, where church bells rang on Sundays and neighbors still believed in a kind of moral duty, whispers began to spread. Some spoke of the girl nurse, barely more than 20, left shivering through the night. Others remembered their own sons in Europe, wondering if they too might be at the mercy of strangers. And so, under cover of darkness, a quiet procession began. Local women, their faces drawn with both fear and resolve, slipped toward the barbed wire fence carrying bundles of wool blankets. The guards, hardened by duty, looked the other way. One witness later recalled that a sergeant muttered, "Let them. It costs us nothing but means everything." The blankets were not lavish old army surplus, scratchy and coarse, yet they carried with them the warmth of a home. When the nurse felt the heavy wool pressed into her hands, she clutched it as though it were her last tether to humanity. She had expected bullets, and now she was given comfort. It was a reversal so profound that she could barely breathe. Around her, other prisoners murmured in disbelief. Some mocked the gesture, calling it propaganda in action. Others simply fell silent, unable to reconcile their training with the kindness before their eyes. The anecdotal accounts multiply in the diaries of that period. A captured officer wrote with bitterness that the Americans weaponized generosity, as if blankets were ammunition. Yet another prisoner noted with astonishment that children sometimes tagged along with their mothers, slipping chocolate bars through the wire to women they could barely see in the dark. For the German nurse, this was no propaganda ploy, but a human gesture cutting across every boundary she had been taught to believe in. It was a dangerous moment for ideology. A blanket could not erase the blood she had seen on the Eastern Front, nor the oath she had sworn to the Reich. But as she lay that night, wrapped in wool, listening to the distant laughter of townsfolk carried by the summer wind, she began to feel the first cracks in her world. Not cracks caused by bombs, but by compassion. She closed her eyes once more, but this time she did not wait for death. She waited for morning, and with it, perhaps, another chance at life. Morning light streamed through the infirmary's narrow windows, cutting across the rows of cots where wounded prisoners lay. The German nurse stirred, her breath shallow, her body aching but alive. As she tried to rise, a firm but gentle hand pressed her shoulder down. She turned her head and froze. Towering above her stood an American surgeon in olive drab, his face impassive, eyes fixed not on her identity, but on the wound that still needed tending. The contradiction was unbearable. For years, she had been taught that Americans were careless butchers, incapable of refined medicine. Nazi training films declared that German science was unmatched, that Allied doctors were crude and untrustworthy. Yet here, in this quiet ward in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, she saw precision, efficiency, and above all, care. The doctor spoke briefly to a nurse beside him. A syringe appeared, gleaming in the morning light. The German prisoner's heart pounded. A needle could mean execution just as easily as cure. But when the liquid coursed into her veins, it was not poison, but morphine, numbing the pain that had consumed her body. The doctor barely looked at her face, to him. She was not a German, not an enemy, but a patient. The realization struck harder than any blow she had endured. Her fate rested in the hands of those she had been ordered to despise, and they chose healing. Nearby, other prisoners experienced similar shocks. Records from 1944 note that over 24,000 POWs required surgical procedures while in American camps. The scale was staggering: appendectomies, amputations, blood transfusions, all provided to men and women who only months earlier had been firing at U.S. troops. Among them, gossip flourished. In one confiscated letter, a German corporal described how the American nurse gave me coffee after the operation, real coffee, not ersatz. I thought I had died already and was in heaven. Such small details, so ordinary to Americans, carried the weight of miracles for those raised on scarcity and fear. For the German nurse, every gesture was an assault on her certainty. She remembered an instructor in Munich insisting that the enemy will strip you of dignity, starve you, and laugh at your suffering. Yet the Americans here did none of those things. Instead, they measured her pulse, adjusted her bandages, and whispered words she could not understand, but somehow knew were meant to soothe. Her heart raced, not from fever, but from confusion. Could mercy truly come from those she had once called monsters? Each throb of her chest seemed to echo with a dangerous truth that ideology was fragile when measured against human touch. As the surgeon moved on to the next cot, she lay staring at the ceiling. The lights above flickered, buzzing faintly, as if mocking her old beliefs. In that hum, she heard the collapse of certainty, the shattering of propaganda, and the faint rhythm of something new trust. The ward expanded into a world she had never imagined. Back in Germany, even before the shortages of late 1944, field hospitals were cramped, underlit, and desperate for supplies. Gauze was rationed, bandages washed and reused until threadbare, morphine reserved for officers. Now, as she was wheeled into the main building of the American camp hospital, the nurse's eyes widened. Rows of beds stretched in perfect lines, each with clean linens, cabinets brimmed with medicine bottles. She glimpsed crates marked U.S. Army Medical Corps stacked to the ceiling. Here was abundance in its rawest form. American hospitals on home soil had treated not only their wounded, but tens of thousands of enemy prisoners. Records from the Surgeon General's office reveal staggering numbers. By 1945, more than 95,000 POWs had been admitted to U.S. Army hospitals across the country, with survival rates surpassing 92%. For someone raised on the rhetoric of German superiority, such figures were unthinkable. How could the so-called decadent democracy achieve what the Reich's vaunted system could not? She listened to the rhythm of the ward nurses clipping thermometers to cots, orderlies pushing carts rattling with glass vials, doctors dictating notes at a speed that suggested not chaos, but orchestration. Each heartbeat of this place seemed synchronized with the machinery of a vast nation. It was as if the same precision that produced bombers every hour now poured itself into preserving life. The gossip among her fellow prisoners reflected this disorientation. One officer grumbled that the Americans flaunted their wealth by feeding them canned peaches, while another whispered in awe about penicillin injections that healed wounds once deemed fatal. A medic captured in Italy told her, in hushed tones, that in one camp a POW with tuberculosis had been given months of treatment, something that in Germany would have been unthinkable for a captured enemy. These stories passed through the barracks like contraband, each tale another crack in the wall of ideology. For the nurse, the shock was more intimate. She recalled her first days in training at Munich University Hospital, where professors insisted that Germany's destiny was to lead the world in medicine. Yet here she lay in an American ward, her veins carrying their drugs, her life preserved by their precision. The contrast gnawed at her pride. It was not only her body under repair, but her sense of what power truly meant. And still, amid the charts and statistics, the experience carried something softer. At night, the lights dimmed but never fully extinguished, leaving a glow across the ward like a city that never slept. She would lie awake, staring at that pale radiance. Realizing it was not death she awaited now, but recovery. The silence was broken by the sound of nurses laughing faintly in the corridor, their voices casual, unburdened, for her. The laughter was unbearable in its normalcy, as if war itself could be forgotten just beyond those doors. She pulled the blanket tighter, torn between resentment and awe, in the hum of fluorescent bulbs. She began to sense the scale of America not just in machines and weapons, but in the simple, relentless will to heal. The days blurred into routine, though nothing about that routine felt ordinary to her. Breakfast trays clattered in, holding bowls of oatmeal, slices of bread, sometimes even fruit luxuries she had not seen since before the war. The German nurse found herself noting every detail with the eye of someone trained to observe the precision of injections, the steadiness of American nurses' hands, the calm efficiency of orderlies. And then, when the ward fell quiet, came the letters and the whispered gossip that carried truth from cot to cot like contraband. Prisoners scribbled in the dim light, careful to fold their notes small enough to smuggle past inspections. Some were intercepted, tucked away in files that now rest in archives. One fragment, written by a captured infantryman, described with disbelief how the American nurse offered me coffee, real coffee, and asked about my mother. Such a small exchange, so easily overlooked in peacetime, struck him as more dangerous to ideology than any bomb. For the German nurse, overhearing these words was like pressing her ear against a door she had been forbidden to open. In another diary later unearthed, a POW wrote about the sound of American nurses' laughter echoing through the hospital corridors. He confessed it cut through me worse than the fever, because it reminded him of evenings in Berlin before the blackout sirens, when laughter was still allowed. Even bitterness turned to silence in the face of such reminders of life. The German nurse herself could not resist joining this unspoken conversation. She whispered one night to a fellow captive, asking how he endured the dissonance between what they had been taught and what they now saw. His reply was a shrug and a single sentence: "They treat us like people." That simple truth gnawed at her more than any ideological lecture ever had. And then came the question that burned in her throat until she could no longer hold it back. During a dressing change, her voice cracked as she asked the American doctor, "Why save me?" The words hung in the sterile air for a moment. The doctor paused, eyes meeting hers. Then he replied, almost casually, as though the answer needed no defense: "Because life matters." The nurse felt the sting of tears she could not suppress. She turned her face to the wall, clutching the wool blanket tighter, as if to shield herself from the enormity of what she had just heard. The audience may feel the same weight here, so let me ask you directly, if you were in her place, would you have trusted the hands of an enemy to save your life? Write your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective makes this story more alive. Recovery was never just a matter of wounds knitting back together for the German nurse. The battle took place in her mind as much as in her body. She had been raised in the rigid discipline of wartime Germany, trained to believe that compassion was weakness, and that enemies existed only to be defeated or destroyed. Now, each passing day in the American hospital threatened to unravel that worldview. She watched as American doctors moved seamlessly from cot to cot. They treated everyone, prisoners, Allied soldiers, even local civilians injured in accidents. To them, the body in need outweighed nationality, ideology, or past crimes. That indifference to politics was more subversive to her than any speech or pamphlet. One evening, she saw a black orderly carrying supplies, his presence acknowledged with respect by white officers in Germany. Such equality would have been unthinkable. The moment unsettled her deeply, for it revealed a world she had been taught could not exist. Her pride resisted, in quiet moments. She told herself that accepting their help was a betrayal of the oath she once swore, yet her survival tethered her to them. She recalled her training under Professor Huber in Munich, who declared that a nurse must belong first to the fatherland. Now, lying under fluorescent lights in Louisiana, she realized she belonged first to life itself. The prisoners around her wrestled with similar contradictions. Some clung stubbornly to their ideology, muttering that American generosity was nothing but performance. Others softened, trading jokes with the nurses, marveling at the endless supply of food, the taste of white bread, the scent of coffee strong enough to fill the ward. A sergeant confessed in a diary later found in Stuttgart, "I hate how grateful I feel. Gratitude feels like surrender." His words echoed her own unspoken conflict. One evening, she caught herself smiling faintly as an American nurse adjusted her pillow. The gesture was so ordinary, so gentle, that it disarmed her more completely than any soldier could. She quickly wiped the smile away, ashamed of her own reaction. To admit comfort was to admit weakness. And yet, her heart told her that what she felt was not weakness, but awakening. Here lies the tension that history often forgets. Wars are fought with steel and fire, but they are won or lost in the fragile chambers of human hearts. The German nurse embodied that truth, trapped between resentment and gratitude, between propaganda and reality. Each heartbeat carried her further from what she once believed, closer to what she could not yet accept. And so I ask you, if mercy were offered by someone you had been taught to hate, would you embrace it, or would you reject it to preserve your pride? Share your answer in the comments. History is not abstract. It lives in choices like these. Weeks passed, and with them came strength. The German nurse could now sit upright without dizziness, could walk a few steps along the ward with her blanket draped around her shoulders like a fragile shield. To the other prisoners, she became a symbol not of defeat, but of survival. They whispered her story in the barracks, passing it on as though it were contraband, the girl who had faced death and woke under American lamps instead of bullets. The blanket itself became more than cloth, rough wool, frayed at the edges, yet imbued with meaning. At night, she would fold it carefully, as though it were sacred. In Germany, blankets were rationed, mothers cutting them in half to share with children in bomb shelters. Here, in the heart of enemy territory, a stranger's blanket had saved her from freezing. It was no weapon, no strategy, yet it pierced deeper than steel. Numbers tell part of the story. By war's end, more than 371,000 German POWs were held across the United States. Camps stretched from Texas to Wisconsin, from Arizona deserts to New England forests. Each one bore witness to small acts of humanity that statistics can barely capture. A doctor treating pneumonia in Nebraska, a farmer delivering apples to the wire fence in Iowa, a child slipping chocolate into scarred hands. For the German nurse, her healing was one thread in this vast tapestry, but it was also intensely personal. She could not erase the memory of waiting for death, nor the voice in her head that still whispered suspicion. Yet gratitude grew like a fragile plant breaking through rubble in one final act. As she prepared to be transferred to another camp, she folded the blanket and held it tight to her chest. She thought of the bullet she had expected, of the darkness she had embraced, and of the light she had awoken to. The blanket became her testament, a symbol she carried of how easily hate can be undone by mercy. America's power was not only in the thunder of bombers or the glow of industrial cities at night. Its greatest strength was quieter, harder to measure, but impossible to forget the ability to turn an enemy waiting for death into a human being reborn. She stepped out of the ward into the morning sun. Guards stood with rifles, but their barrels pointed to the ground. She drew the blanket tighter, her heart steady, her steps uncertain yet alive. For her. This was not victory or surrender. It was something greater, the proof that compassion could outlive war. History is often told in numbers: the battles counted, the bombs dropped, the soldiers lost. Yet behind those vast statistics linger moments so intimate that they risk being forgotten. The story of the German nurse is one such moment, hidden in the folds of a wool blanket, carried in the silence of an operating room, preserved in the faint tremor of a whispered question, "Why save me?" Her survival was not a matter of politics, not a calculated strategy, but a simple act of humanity. American doctors could have turned away. Civilians could have closed their doors. Instead, they offered light where there had been darkness, and warmth where there had been only fear. In doing so, they revealed a truth as enduring as any military victory, that the most profound strength of a nation lies not only in its power to destroy, but in its power to heal. The nurse would never forget the sensation of rough wool against her skin, or the hum of lamps overhead as her heart beat stubbornly on. In time, the war would end, the camps would empty, and soldiers would return to their homes. But for her, and for countless others like her, the memory remained the realization that mercy could come from the very hands once thought to be monstrous. We are left. Then, with an image, a young woman, once trembling in the face of death, steps into the morning sun with a blanket clutched to her chest. Around her, the camp stands quiet, rifles lowered, silence settling over the soil. She is no longer simply a prisoner, nor an enemy. She is a testament to compassion that defies hatred, to life preserved against all expectation.